Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the endless frontier, each flake a tiny hammer striking the earth. The wind howled through the pines like a chorus of lost souls, bending trees and scattering the last remnants of autumn leaves. In the midst of that frozen wilderness stood a cabin, its logs darkened by decades of storms, smoke curling from the crooked chimney. This was the world of Gideon Hawthorne, silent, solitary, and unyielding. Gideon himself was a man of legend, though few had truly looked past the tales whispered in town. Towering over most men, with shoulders broad as a barn door and hands that could split timber as easily as bread, he moved with a quiet authority that made people stop and stare. They called him Titan Hawthorne, not because he sought admiration, but because he had earned it. And yet, for all his strength, he had chosen a life of isolation. The cabin was both sanctuary and prison, a place where the fire crackled and the wind's fury could not reach him. Inside, Gideon chopped wood with deliberate, steady strokes. Each swing of the axe was accompanied by the dull thunk of timber meeting timber, a rhythm as constant as the beating of his own heart. His beard, streaked with silver, caught the flickering glow of the fire. Outside, snow piled against the logs and drifts, and the distant howl of a wolf echoed through the valley, a reminder that the frontier respected neither the meek nor the strong, it simply endured. Town folk spoke of him in hushed tones, often as much in fear as in respect. Titan Hawthorne, they would say. Hands like iron. Moves like the wind, but speaks less than a crow. And it was true. Gideon rarely went into town. The saloon, with its laughter and its knives, held no interest for him. Idle chatter, gossip, and drunken boasts were distractions he had long since learned to avoid. He preferred the company of the snow, the trees, and the steady fire that never demanded more than attention. Yet even in the solitude he had chosen, there was a quiet ache, an emptiness that had grown over years without a companion, without children, without a life shared. The walls of the cabin held memories only he knew, echoes of losses too small for anyone else to notice, but large enough to shape every choice he had made. The frontier had demanded strength, demanded silence, demanded endurance. And Gideon had given it, every day, in full measure. That evening, as the wind drove icy shards against the windows, Gideon paused and listened. He could hear the familiar creak of timber under the weight of snow, the crackle of the fire as it ate through dry logs, the whisper of the storm outside. It was a rhythm he had known for years. His eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the darkened forest beyond the cabin. The world was harsh, unkind, and relentless, but it was a world he understood, a world he had mastered. And then, cutting through the howl of the wind, came a sound that did not belong, a knock. Sharp, deliberate, insistent. Not the rattle of branches against the cabin, not the groan of frozen wood, not the gust of wind through the pines. This was human. Someone seeking help. Someone in need. Gideon set down the axe and straightened, his shadow long against the firelight. He crossed the cabin floor, boots crunching on the rough wooden planks, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a whip, and standing there, trembling, was a small girl. Her hair was damp and tangled, her cheeks red from the snow, her dress torn and threadbare. Fear clung to her like a second skin. "They hurt my mama, she can't get up," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Gideon studied her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. In all his years on the frontier, he had seen hardship, cruelty, and desperation, but there was something in this child's eyes that pierced his solitude, that demanded action. He crouched slightly, careful not to overwhelm her with his massive frame. "Who is your mama, child?" he asked, his voice low, steady, unshakable. "She's Clara and Whitmore, please, help her," the girl said, clutching a small wooden horse to her chest. Gideon's jaw tightened. He had seen Clara in town, soft-featured and fearful, her spirit bruised by a man's anger. He had looked away then, bound by his own code of silence. But now, with the plea of a child cutting through the storm, he could not turn away. He stepped aside. "Come inside," he said simply. And in that moment, the stillness of his cabin shifted. For the first time in years, the storm outside was not the only one Gideon would face. The warmth of the cabin struck Elsie May like a sudden sunrise. Her small body, chilled and trembling, sagged with relief as Gideon closed the door behind her. Snowflakes clung to her hair and coat, dripping onto the rough wooden floor. The fire's glow reflected off her wide, fearful eyes, making them seem almost too large for her delicate face. Gideon knelt to her level, the weight of his presence both intimidating and reassuring. "They hurt my mama, she can't get up," Elsie repeated, her voice breaking, clutching the carved wooden horse as if it were a shield against the world. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that struck deeper than any gunshot or snowstorm. Gideon's silence stretched, a heavy pause that filled the cabin. Outside, the wind whined and twisted, but inside, the room was a different kind of storm, one of moral reckoning and the stirrings of a man who had long avoided entanglement with other people's suffering. Gideon's eyes softened, though his face remained set, like carved stone. "Who is your mama, child?" he asked again, steady as the axe he had rested beside the hearth. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being both feared and respected, but now tempered by the cautious gentleness he reserved for the helpless. "Clara and Whitmore, please," Elsie whispered, tears forming along the edges of her lashes. "Please, help her. He won't stop." Her small hands shook as she pressed the wooden horse closer to her chest, knuckles white with fear and determination. Gideon's jaw tightened. Clara and Whitmore. He had seen her in town on more than one occasion, a woman of soft features overshadowed by bruises of both body and spirit. Warren Whitmore, her husband, was a man known for his quick temper and cruel streak. In the past, Gideon had looked away, bound by the unspoken rules of their harsh frontier life. But the plea of this child shattered the walls he had built around himself. "Come closer," Gideon said, his voice low, steady. Elsie May stepped forward, tentative, and he held out a massive, calloused hand, not to intimidate, but to guide. She hesitated, then placed her tiny hand in his, warmth meeting warmth. In that moment, the fire did more than fend off the cold, it seemed to ignite a long-dormant resolve within Gideon. He moved to the table and fetched a rough blanket, wrapping it around the shivering child. "You'll be safe here for the night," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll go to her. But you must be strong." His words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of promise, the kind that could only come from a man who had lived by his own unbreakable code. Elsie May nodded, her small face pressed against the warmth of the blanket, yet her eyes never left his. Will he hurt us too?" she asked, voice barely audible. Gideon's gaze hardened. "Not while I'm here," he said, voice steady as a stone wall. The wind outside battered the cabin, rattling the logs, but inside, a sense of quiet determination settled. The frontier was unforgiving, and men like Warren Whitmore thought the world owed them obedience. Gideon knew better. He had endured the solitude, the storms, and the lawless ways of men, and now he would not allow innocence to suffer under another man's cruelty. He crouched to her level again, speaking with the weight of certainty and care. "We leave at first light. I will not fail her, or you." Elsie May clutched her wooden horse tighter, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. In her small, trembling form, Gideon saw more than fear, he saw courage, the spark of survival that refused to yield even in the face of violence. It stirred something deep within him, a resolve that went beyond mere duty. He would confront the world outside, the anger and malice waiting in the Whitmore shack. He would not retreat. Outside, the storm roared, but inside the cabin, a new force had entered the frontier, a man who had lived in silence, now awakened to protect, to defend, and to act when the world demanded courage. And in the hush of the fire-lit cabin, Elsie May's whispered plea had become a summons to a reckoning that neither Gideon nor the Whitmores would soon forget. Tomorrow, the journey would begin. And Gideon Hawthorne, the giant of the frontier, would step beyond the confines of his solitude, carrying both the fragile and the brave into a blizzard that would test every ounce of his strength, and the measure of his heart. The first rays of dawn cut through the snow-laden horizon, painting the world in pale shades of gold and white. Gideon Hawthorne stood near the doorway of his cabin, eyes scanning the relentless winter landscape. Beside him, Elsie May clutched her small wooden horse, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The fire behind them had died to embers overnight, but the warmth of purpose now burned stronger than any flame. "Who is your mama, again?" Gideon asked gently, though his voice carried the weight of inevitability. "Clara and Whitmore," Elsie replied, her voice trembling yet resolute. "Please, don't let him hurt her." Gideon's jaw tightened. He had seen the Whitmore woman in town before, soft-spoken, timid, yet with a glimmer of pride that refused to be extinguished. Her husband, Warren Whitmore, was a man whose temper was notorious, whose fists spoke louder than any words. It had always pained Gideon to see Clara in that life, but he had stayed silent, bound by the rigid code of the frontier, until now. "Stay close," Gideon instructed, his voice steady as stone. "We leave at once." The journey through the snow-covered expanse was brutal. Every step sank deep into drifts, the cold biting at Gideon's cheeks and fingers, yet he pressed on. Elsie May followed closely, her small frame shivering but persistent, the wooden horse held tight in her hands. Gideon moved beside her, a giant walking through a whitewashed wilderness, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The wind whipped against them, carrying the scent of pine and the faint tang of ice, but he remained unyielding, his eyes fixed ahead. As they approached the Whitmore's shack, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. The structure was barely standing, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, walls streaked with the scars of neglect and past violence. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, a feeble sign of warmth in the otherwise desolate landscape. The door hung crooked, swinging slightly with each gust of wind, and the sound of muffled movement inside hinted at the suffering within. Gideon motioned for Elsie May to stay back. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim light revealing Clara's frail form collapsed on the floor. Bruises marred her arms and face, and her clothing was torn. Yet there was still a dignity in the way she held her head, a quiet defiance despite the pain that weighed on her. "Clara," Gideon said, his voice low but commanding, "I'm here to help. You'll be safe." Clara's eyes lifted slowly, widening in recognition. There was fear, yes, but also a flicker of hope that had long been buried beneath years of abuse. "Gideon," she whispered, disbelief lacing her voice. I didn't expect." "No time for words," Gideon interrupted gently. "We leave now. You're coming with me." He moved with surprising gentleness, lifting her as though she weighed no more than a feather. The contrast between his immense frame and his careful handling of her fragility was striking, a silent promise that no harm would reach her while he was near. Elsie May followed, stepping over the threshold, the little horse clutched tightly as though it, too, were a talisman against the harshness of the world. The trek back to the cabin tested every ounce of strength Gideon possessed. Snow whipped against their faces, the wind attempting to push them back with relentless fury. Clara murmured weakly, shivering against his chest, and Gideon adjusted his grip, steady and unyielding, as if he were the very embodiment of a fortress. Elsie May trudged beside him, small feet sinking into snowdrifts, yet her eyes remained fixed on him with trust and determination. Finally, the familiar outline of the cabin emerged through the storm. Gideon placed Clara on the bed, wrapping her in blankets, while Elsie May set down her wooden horse, eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. The fire was rekindled, crackling and casting dancing shadows across the room. For a moment, silence reigned. The storm outside still raged, but inside, a fragile sense of safety settled over them. Gideon moved to tend to Clara's wounds, his hands rough but careful, his expression unreadable yet resolute. In that quiet moment, it became clear, the path ahead would not be easy. Danger was coming, and the frontier would demand courage. But Gideon had made his choice. He would protect them, no matter the cost. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the promise of trials yet to come. Inside, the warmth of fire and newfound hope glimmered, a small beacon against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. By mid-morning, the snowstorm showed no signs of relenting. The sky was a blur of white, the horizon vanishing into the icy haze. Gideon Hawthorne, towering and steady, prepared for the journey that would take him and the small girl, Elsie May, back to his cabin with Clara and Whitmore. Supplies were packed into a rough satchel, blankets, food, and a few essentials, though Gideon knew the harshness of the frontier would be their greatest challenge. Clara, weak and bruised, leaned on Gideon as they stepped outside. Each step sank into the drifts, snow clinging to their clothing, icy wind slicing across exposed skin. Elsie May struggled beside them, tiny hands clutching the wooden horse as if it could ward off the storm itself. Yet the child's determination never wavered. She trusted Gideon completely, and that trust strengthened his resolve. The Whitmore's shack receded behind them, a jagged silhouette swallowed by the white expanse. The sight of the ruined structure, a home broken by cruelty and neglect, stirred a cold anger in Gideon. He had long known the law of the land was slow, impotent in the face of men like Warren Whitmore. In the absence of justice, he would become the hand of protection. Clara shivered against his chest as they trudged forward. "Thank you for coming," she murmured, her voice faint but sincere. Her pride was intact despite the injuries, and it only made Gideon more determined. He adjusted his grip, ensuring she was secure without causing further discomfort. The giant of the frontier had long known strength, but today, his power was measured in gentleness. Elsie May's small legs struggled to keep pace. "I can help," she said between breaths, lifting her little feet high to push through the drifts. Gideon looked down at her, a mixture of admiration and concern in his gaze. "Stay close," he instructed, and she nodded, leaning into the wind with grit beyond her years. The journey grew perilous as the storm intensified. Snow blinded their eyes, drifted into their mouths, and made every step a test of endurance. The cold was relentless, but Gideon moved with deliberate, unwavering determination. His massive frame carved a path through the white wilderness, each step leaving a mark that would soon be erased by the wind. Clara murmured, exhaustion evident in her voice, but Gideon's steady pace and protective presence gave her courage. Finally, the outline of his cabin emerged, a sanctuary in the heart of the blizzard. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney, promising warmth and safety. Gideon pushed forward, bracing against the gusts, and stepped inside, setting Clara gently on the bed. The fire roared back to life at his command, crackling and casting flickering light across the room. Elsie May dropped the wooden horse beside the bed, her small form exhausted but relieved. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the fire and the distant howl of the storm. Gideon removed the snow-laden coats, wrapping blankets around Clara, and carefully tended to her wounds. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with surprising delicacy, each motion a silent promise that no harm would come to her under his watch. Elsie May settled on a chair near the fire, watching him. "He'll come back, won't he?" she asked, voice quivering. Gideon paused, meeting her wide, frightened eyes. "If he does," he said, voice low and steady, "he'll find I am not a man to be trifled with." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of unspoken threats and a resolve forged by decades of hardship. The frontier demanded courage, and Gideon's code was clear: protect the innocent, face danger without hesitation. Outside, the storm raged, bending trees and driving ice across the land. Inside, the cabin was filled with quiet determination, warmth, and a fragile sense of safety. The journey had begun, but Gideon knew the trial was far from over. Warren Whitmore would not remain idle. And when the confrontation came, it would test every ounce of his strength, both the muscle that could fell a man and the heart that refused to let cruelty stand. For now, the wounded woman and her child were safe, cradled by the hands of a giant who had chosen to step out of isolation and into the storm. And as Gideon stood by the fire, eyes on the whirling snow outside, he understood something he had not known in years: courage was not measured by solitude, but by the willingness to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. Word of Clara's escape traveled faster than the winter wind. Warren Whitmore, prideful and cruel, was not a man accustomed to being thwarted. By midday, he had gathered a small band of men from town, men eager for violence, loyal to his fury, and careless of the frontier's law. They mounted their horses, faces set with determination, and rode through the snow toward the cabin where Gideon Hawthorne now sheltered the woman and child he had vowed to protect. Inside the cabin, Gideon had finished tending to Clara's wounds. Elsie May sat near the fire, her eyes wide as she listened to the howl of the storm outside. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the tension building in the frozen landscape beyond. Gideon's jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the white blur of movement hinted at approaching danger. He had long lived by the principle of avoiding trouble, but trouble had a way of finding the innocent, and he would not stand by. Clara, wrapped in blankets, observed him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Her bruises were fading, but her fear was still raw. "He'll come," she said softly, voice trembling. "He won't leave us alone." Gideon's hands clenched briefly. "Then we'll meet him. We'll meet them all," he said, voice low and steady. There was no bravado in his words, only certainty. Every action he had taken, every step through snow and storm, had led to this moment. The frontier was cruel, but Gideon had learned its laws: protect the helpless, face violence with unwavering resolve, and never flinch before those who preyed on weakness. The first sound of approaching hooves was faint at first, carried by the storm. Gideon moved to the cabin door, inspecting the perimeter. He made no noise as he adjusted the fire and positioned Clara and Elsie May where they would be safest. Then, as the shadowed figures drew closer, he stood tall, a mountain of a man framed against the flickering firelight. Warren and his men arrived, their horses stomping and snorting in the deep snow, anger blazing in their eyes. Warren dismounted, fists clenched, face twisted in fury. "Bring her back, Hawthorne," he barked. "She belongs to me." Gideon's response was measured, his voice calm but firm. "She belongs to no man but herself," he said. Every word carried the weight of his decades on the frontier, the wisdom earned through survival and silence. "And you will not harm her again." The tension broke like lightning. Men lunged, fists swinging, boots sliding on icy planks. Gideon met them with unshakable strength, each movement precise, controlled, and devastating. A swing of his fist sent one man sprawling, a firm grip redirected another's momentum, leaving him off balance in the snow. He moved through the chaos like a force of nature, calm and terrifying, a guardian shaped by years of solitude and hardship. Clara and Elsie May huddled together, fear in their eyes, yet the presence of Gideon gave them courage. They could feel his resolve as tangibly as the warmth of the fire, a barrier against the world's cruelty. Warren's fury escalated with each failed attempt to break Gideon's defense. Rage clouded his judgment, leaving him exposed, and Gideon struck with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime surviving the unforgiving frontier. Finally, Warren fell back, humiliated and defeated, his men retreating under Gideon's relentless presence. Breathing hard but composed, Gideon surveyed the scene. The snowstorm outside raged on, but inside, order had returned. The cabin, once quiet and solitary, now stood as a sanctuary, its walls holding firm against both the elements and the threat of human violence. Clara and Elsie May exchanged glances, relief flooding their faces. The danger had passed, at least for now, but Gideon knew the frontier's trials were far from over. Yet as he returned to the fire, checking blankets and ensuring the women were safe, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He had stood against cruelty, protected the innocent, and emerged unshaken. Outside, the storm continued its relentless dance across the snow, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of peace lingered. The confrontation had been met, the immediate threat defeated, and the bond between Gideon and the family he had chosen to protect had begun to form, strong and unbreakable. The blizzard had grown relentless by nightfall, snow swirling like white fire across the frontier. Outside Gideon Hawthorne's cabin, shadows moved in the storm, Warren Whitmore and his men, hardened by anger and pride, pressing forward through the drifts with weapons ready. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of warmth, firelight flickering across the rough wooden walls. Gideon's eyes were steady, unblinking, scanning the encroaching chaos as Clara and Elsie huddled near the hearth. "They're coming," Clara whispered, fear threading her voice. "He won't stop." Gideon's massive hands rested lightly on the table, but there was a tension in his frame, a coiled readiness that spoke of the storm he had weathered outside and the one now approaching. "Then we'll meet them," he said simply. No anger in his tone, just certainty. His voice carried the weight of decades spent surviving the harsh frontier, of living in silence and solitude, now poised to defend the innocent. The first figure lunged through the cabin door, a man emboldened by Whitmore's fury. Gideon met him with the calm force of a mountain. His fist swung once, precise and devastating, and the attacker staggered back into the snow outside. There was no chaos in Gideon's movements, only the efficiency of experience. Each strike, each block, moved like clockwork, unrelenting yet controlled. Warren charged next, fists raised, eyes blazing with pride and rage. Gideon caught him in a firm hold, redirecting the man's momentum effortlessly. One swing of his arm, and Warren crashed to the snow-drifted ground outside, humiliation painted across his face. The other men hesitated, stunned by the sheer power and calm of the Titan before them. Gideon's presence was a force that could not be argued with, a barrier between the innocent and the cruelty they had endured. Inside the cabin, Clara clutched Elsie tightly, watching Gideon's every movement. Her fear did not vanish, but it mingled with awe, a sense that safety had returned, fragile but real. Elsie Mae's small hands gripped her wooden horse, but her wide eyes reflected trust, her faith in Gideon anchoring her against the storm outside. Warren rose again, fury clouding his judgment. He swung blindly, desperation replacing strategy. Gideon met him once more, delivering a controlled blow that sent the man staggering into the snow, defeated not only in body but in spirit. Standing over him, Gideon's voice was steady, resonant, and unyielding. "You belong to no man. You belong to yourself." The words hung in the storm, unbroken and undeniable. Warren's pride crumbled, his men retreating into the white night, leaving the cabin and its occupants untouched. Outside, the wind screamed, snow whipped against the logs, but the threat had passed. Inside, the cabin was still, the only movement the flickering firelight dancing across Gideon's determined face. He returned to the hearth, checking blankets, adjusting the fire, and ensuring Clara and Elsie were warm and safe. The storm still raged outside, but inside, a fragile peace settled. The battle had been won, but more than that, a vow had been kept, innocence protected, cruelty confronted, justice measured not in law but in courage and strength. Clara, still trembling, finally dared to meet his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with gratitude and relief. I don't know how to repay you." Gideon offered no answer but a simple nod. Words were unnecessary, action had spoken louder than any promise. Elsie Mae nestled closer to her mother, the carved wooden horse resting safely beside them, a small talisman of survival and hope. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but it no longer threatened the cabin. Within its walls, warmth, safety, and a quiet sense of victory remained. Gideon stood watch, eyes still scanning the whitened horizon, aware that the frontier's trials never ended, yet strengthened by the knowledge that today, he had defended those who could not defend themselves. And in that quiet, firelit room, 3 lives, 1 giant, 1 woman, and 1 child, had begun to form a fragile, enduring bond, born of danger, courage, and the unyielding will of a man who had chosen to stand against evil when all others would turn away. The storm had begun to ebb, though the wind still moaned through the trees like a distant lament. Inside the cabin, warmth and safety returned as the fire crackled and spat sparks into the hearth. Gideon Hawthorne moved with quiet purpose, tending to the small details that meant survival and comfort, checking blankets, stoking the fire, and ensuring that Clara and Elsie Mae were wrapped in layers of warmth against the lingering cold. Clara, though bruised and exhausted, sat upright, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of broth. The first taste of nourishment in what felt like forever brought a small, grateful sigh. She looked across the cabin at Gideon, a mixture of awe and gratitude in her eyes. "You saved us," she whispered. I can't believe someone would come for us." Gideon offered no words of self-praise. He moved past her to the window, scanning the white landscape. Snow still fell, drifting lazily in the softened light of late afternoon, but there was no sign of Whitmore or his men. The immediate danger had passed, leaving only the quiet relief of survival and the soft echoes of a battle that had tested both strength and resolve. Elsie May, ever vigilant, perched near the fire, her wooden horse resting on the floor beside her. She traced its carved features with tiny fingers, her eyes occasionally flicking up to Gideon as if seeking reassurance. "Will he come back?" she asked softly, voice laced with both hope and lingering fear. Gideon turned to her, his massive frame towering yet not threatening. "Not today," he said, voice calm but firm. "And as long as I am here, he will not harm you or your mother." His eyes softened as they met hers, the weight of his promise unspoken but undeniable. In that moment, the cabin felt more than shelter, it was a sanctuary, a place where courage, care, and quiet strength converged to protect those who could not defend themselves. Clara reached out tentatively, her hand brushing Gideon's as she adjusted the blankets around her shoulders. I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You risked yourself for us." Gideon's expression remained steady, but there was warmth in his gaze. He moved to place another log on the fire, the glow illuminating the rough lines of his face and the silver streaks of his hair. "No thanks needed," he said simply. "You are safe. That is enough." For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive. The storm outside, though still wild, could not touch the quiet domesticity within. Elsie May began to play with the wooden horse, her laughter small but bright, filling the room with a fragile sense of normalcy. Clara watched her daughter, her own smile tentative but genuine, as she realized that for the first time in many years, they had a chance to heal. Gideon moved through the cabin with deliberate care, checking the fire, adjusting blankets, and making sure the women had water and warmth. The silence between them was comfortable, filled not with words but with the knowledge that survival, protection, and trust had been earned. The frontier was harsh, but inside these walls, they had carved a space untouched by cruelty, a space where courage and care had prevailed. Outside, the storm continued its distant howl, a reminder that life on the frontier was never fully safe, never fully predictable. Inside, though, Clara and Elsie May felt something they had not known in years: security. Gideon, once solitary and silent, had become their guardian, a steadfast presence whose strength was matched only by the quiet warmth of his actions. As evening fell and the snow settled into soft drifts outside, the cabin glowed with a fragile hope. The immediate danger was over. Wounds would heal, trust would grow, and the quiet bonds formed in the firelight would become the foundation for a life that had once seemed impossible. The frontier's trials were not over, but for now, 3 lives had found safety, care, and the beginnings of connection. The storm had passed at last, leaving the world outside a silent, sparkling expanse of snow. The trees were weighed down with white, their branches bending in quiet submission to the relentless winter. Sunlight broke through scattered clouds, casting the landscape in a pale, gentle glow. Within the cabin, warmth and life radiated, a stark contrast to the harshness that still clung to the frontier outside. Gideon Hawthorne stood by the hearth, the fire's glow illuminating his broad frame. He watched Elsie May play near the rug, her small laughter bright and clear in the otherwise still room. Her wooden horse had become a companion of comfort, placed carefully beside her as she imagined adventures far from the cruelty they had fled. Her cheeks, once chapped and red from the snow, now glowed with a warmth that only safety and belonging could bring. Clara and Whitmore, wrapped in thick blankets, moved to the hearth to tend to the fire alongside Gideon. Her bruises were fading, but her eyes still held a mixture of fatigue and relief. She caught his gaze and offered a small, grateful smile, one that spoke more than words ever could. For the first time in years, she had found someone who would stand between her and the world's cruelty. Gideon's hands, strong and rough from years of labor and survival, moved with gentle precision as he stoked the flames. The cabin, once silent and solitary, now felt alive with a quiet, enduring rhythm. Each crackle of the fire, each movement of the two women within his care, brought a sense of purpose he had not felt in decades. The solitude that had once been his sanctuary now seemed incomplete, as if the presence of Clara and Elsie May had filled the spaces he had long ignored. Elsie May scampered to him, tugging at his sleeve. "Gideon," she said softly, eyes wide, "are we safe now?" He knelt to her level, massive hands gently resting on her small shoulders. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, calm, yet carrying a depth of promise that no words could fully capture. "As long as I am here, nothing will harm you or your mama." The words were simple, but in them lay decades of strength, vigilance, and unwavering resolve. The frontier outside might be unforgiving, but inside this cabin, they had found refuge. Clara moved closer, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You've given us more than safety. You've given us hope." Gideon's gaze shifted to the fire, contemplative. "No thanks needed," he said softly. "We look after one another. That is all." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had long survived on his own, but who had now discovered the warmth of shared life. The cabin was filled with the soft sounds of domesticity, Elsie May's small laughter, Clara's gentle movements, the fire crackling in steady rhythm. Outside, snow continued to settle in soft drifts, the world muted under winter's calm. Inside, a fragile peace had taken root, one built on courage, protection, and the beginning of trust and connection. Gideon stepped to the window, looking out across the snow-blanketed valley. The wind had died, leaving a serene silence that stretched for miles. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. His life had been one of solitude and endurance, but now it was also one of purpose beyond survival. The frontier remained harsh, the world unpredictable, but he had found something that even the coldest winters could not strip away, the promise of family, of care, and of hope renewed. Elsie May ran to him again, lifting her small arms. He scooped her up gently, placing her on his shoulder, while Clara watched, smiling with a warmth that no winter chill could diminish. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, was now home, a place where 3 lives had begun to heal, to trust, and to hope. Outside, the snow glistened in the sunlight, sparkling like diamonds across the frozen land. Inside, the firelight danced on walls that had witnessed bravery, compassion, and resilience. Gideon Hawthorne, the giant of the frontier, stood tall, not alone, but as guardian, protector, and silent heart of this newfound family. And in the quiet glow of the cabin, the storm had ended, and a fragile, enduring hope had begun. Enjoyed Gideon's story? Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another Wild West adventure.